Okay, so this builds on to the other sessions. I think you've come to most of the sessions.
I've only managed to come to one of it.
Yeah. So it's building on to the other sessions and looking particularly, and I was quite interested in the last session when you were saying, Claire, that your dissertation is now much shorter than the 20,000. So it sounds to me as though it's getting more like a journal article.
Yeah, and that is one of the things that we've actually discussed as a team, as to whether we just change it completely or give students an option to either stick with the dissertation, which at the moment is 10,000, or the proposal that we've got out, team and partners at the moment, is whether they do a some kind of presentation, whether that's a poster presentation or oral presentation of like their findings mainly, I suppose, and a journal article, and whether we assess their research project like that. So they've still got to do the research project, but not be so obsessed with the chapters. Yeah. And we were kind of thinking of it from a staff perspective, from marking and support. I mean, they would still need the support to undertake the research, but there wouldn't be that looking at each chapter.
And they've got something they can publish.
And they've got something they can publish.
All the better ones are publishable, aren't they?
So we had kind of mixed views from students and partners, which is why we haven't gone ahead with it yet. And currently we're thinking, do we give them the option? So within the module guide, put the option of the two.
Sounds very interesting. I mean, obviously you won't have chapters, but you still have sections, and they still have different moves. Yeah. So if you're going to go to that option, then what... we were talking about methodology in the last session. Your methodology section is going to be quite brief, I would have thought, but what journal editors and journal audience, they're really interested in findings. So it's really important to think through how findings are presented. So one of the things I personally, I'm in the process of nearly finished my PhD. I actually found my findings chapters the hardest to write because they're quite different. The work just changes direction at that point. And one of the things that you have to think about is this business about your authorial voice and how you present claims for the works that you've undertaken. So we're going to look at that and then think about how you can make plans for dissemination of your writing, which might be helpful for you, Claire, if you're thinking of changing the module. So the results should be presented so that the organisation allows the reader to get a clear picture of how the research questions have been addressed in practice. So it's once again, it does go back to this idea of having this golden thread or this red thread that runs through the piece of work. And very often the research question is a very good anchor to keep that thread going. It's advisable to present your findings with reference to the objectives of the study. The sections may be characterised by figures and tables, but one of the things that students find quite difficult, I think, and I would think this is probably at all levels, that you have and certainly I know what I have found difficult is you'll get very attached to this data, and it's all important to you, but it might not all be important to the reader. So it's about making that selection of what you're actually going to present, and that applies whatever the methodology. You can't actually present all of the data. So it's very delicate because you must avoid stressing the significant results that may not be relevant, or to emphasise the facts that are most interesting to us, ignoring other significant results. So very often, if you do your research conscientiously, is that what you come up with might not be what you were anticipating. So the data that you present will be the basis for the argumentation of the discussion. So results and discussion sections have a really strong relationship with each other. So these are just examples that I've picked out from some examples of student writing that they've shared with us. I think the important thing, it goes back to what we said at the beginning, that having a strong introduction is really, really crucial, and that really matters. Signposting the reader really, really matters when it comes to results chapter. And I think it helps to signpost you as a writer to be really clear about what you're actually going to be presenting. So you need to go straight in with what you're actually going to do in the chapter. So this is just an example from a qualitative chapter. Here's another one from an audit, a bit more of a detailed introduction, but being very clear how the chapter's structured and what the reader can find in each section. And that's a literature review chapter. So, very clear examples. So, what this is thinking about how so you need a macro structure, obviously, and the research questions and the research objectives very often help with the macro structure for the results chapter. But then there's that kind of micro structure. And I don't know what your experiences have been of writing up yourself, your own. Sometimes one of the things that I felt, it can feel really descriptive. So you're just, and it should be descriptive, but it needs to be analytical at the same time. So this is just one sort of acronym which I think is quite helpful. I've put the hypothesis in brackets because obviously some qualitative research, well, most qualitative research won't necessarily have a hypothesis, but this idea that you present your facts or you present your findings and you need evidence to support your finding. Your findings are your evidence. You need data to support the findings in the form of evidence. You then need to create an argument about what's going on and then perhaps add to theory. So what we mean by theory really is the outcomes of what you've found. And obviously it depends. This is very general because it depends. If you've got you see on that first slide, student use the health beliefs model, so you're already going in with a theory, whereas some people might have a more inductive approach where they're generating theory from the results. So it needs to build a clear argument from data to knowledge. So students, writers should not be presenting raw, undigested data. Results need to be displayed in a clear, informative way, making it clear how the research questions have been answered. Also, really important to be open about shortcomings and limitations of the research. That makes you appear more reflexive as a writer. And I think it's a good, rather than wait to the discussion or the conclusion, it's a good idea to start in the findings to talk about what was limited, either X people didn't reply to the survey, or you had more men than women, or whatever the limitations might be. So, one of the things that is quite difficult for all of us as writers is developing our voice, because what we're trying to do when we write, I know students talk about this, have this idea of writing for marks, but once you go beyond writing a master's dissertation, once you start writing a PhD or you're writing for publication, you're not just writing for marks, you're writing for an external audience. You're trying to join a conversation. So you need to make discursive choices where you're going to actually position yourself in relation to what you find. So you want to emphasise certain things about your findings and you want to de-emphasise other things. So there are certain resources that as novice writers, we can think about or we can use when we want to actually emphasise or de-emphasise certain facts. So one discourse mechanism is what's known as a hedge. And a hedge expresses what we qualify what we want to say. So what a hedge, it indicates the value that the reader gives to the given statement, considering the degree of accuracy or reliability it deserves. And the use of these expressions implies that the author's claims are based on plausible reasoning rather than on certainty of knowledge. So you can say, we would say the results of these studies conducted by these authors suggest. So you're not saying it definitely, what you're saying when you're saying that results suggest, you're kind of sitting on the fence yourself, but you're saying that this might indicate something rather than it definitely indicates something. Or instead of saying these results are best explained by, we could say these results may be explained, or these results may probably explained by. And it's quite interesting because I think our healthcare students use a lot of hedges in their writing. And when you write for publication, authors, journals they don't want you to use hedges. They want you to use the next discourse mechanism, which is a booster. So a booster is when you're expressing confidence in your claims and making your degree of involvement with the topic. You're addressing your degree of involvement with the topic. So the extent to which the writer emphasises his or her words by making use of these resources shows which information she considers he shared with the reader, as well as his sense of belonging to a group that shares the viewpoint. So instead of saying this study would be one of the activities, we could say the study is without a doubt one of the activities. So in the following sentences, the adverbs and adjectives used are things like clearly, precisely, clear, crucial. Also allow writers to emphasise what is being claimed, or suggest it, or this is precisely the aspect the studies reviewed present, in our opinion, are clear. This question seems crucial since. So can you see the difference between hedges and boosters? So the balance reveals the author's commitment and with the content of their text, and the relationship that they're establishing with his or her readers, or his or her position in a particularly disciplinary community. So if you're a well-known author and you've published a lot and you're very well known, you can increase the use of boosters because nobody's probably going to challenge you because you're well known and you can make these comments. And what you see with people that publish a lot, they self-reference a lot, or they choose who they're going to. You have to be quite careful who you reference when you write for publication within a particular journal. You need to perhaps reference people that have also published in that journal, and you have to be very careful about how you treat your claims alongside their claims. So the other thing that we can do is we can use attitudinal markers which suggest the writer's emotional relationship with, rather than their epistemic claims. So the epistemic claims are the things that are based on knowledge and fact and what you found. But also we have quite an emotional relationship with what we're writing about, and also because I can say, because we're nurses, we also have professional values and that are quite important, and we might look at a particular phenomenon. What's interesting me about the students that come to the writing workshops, we very often have psychology students, and it's really interesting that they're doing very similar topics to the healthcare students, but they would present them in a different way for that disciplinary community, if that makes sense. So the sort of things that we use are preferably, unfortunately, fortunately. So you're actually making a value judgment and presenting that. But what you're trying to do, you're trying to appeal to the disciplinary audience. So you're trying to, it's kind of an implicit sharing of values. So we would have certain values as nurses that maybe medical practitioners wouldn't have, or other disciplines wouldn't have. So you can also have use a lot of self-reference in the text. So I did ask you to bring some examples. If you haven't, I've got one.
I've got one.
And I wondered if you would like to go to the results section and spend some time looking at the way in which the language that's used and examples of hedges and boosters that you think that the authors are making. I've got one here on, and then we can have a discussion. So, as I said, the discussion and the results obviously have a very close relationship with one another, and it's very interesting what you said, Liz, that the way in which you wrote your master's dissertation. So the importance of the discussion is, I mean, that is one way of looking at findings. It's what I found, and the discussion is what I think. But it's also important as well as to argue the way in which the results obtained answer the research questions. So it's very important. Obviously, in this journal article, I guess one criticism, because very often in your discussion section, if you're writing for publication and you're writing a lit review, they do want you to return to the objectives. And I probably would, if that were me. I would probably have had maybe if it was just one paragraph to say about how this, you know, what I set out to find and what I did find. So one should not go too far when extracting conclusions or implications from the results that may not be adequately grounded in the data. So that once again goes back to thinking about what you're actually going to present. One must build one's own arguments logically and consequently refer to the results only when appropriate, avoiding the repetition of a description that should have been included in the results section. So it's obviously important just to summarise rather than go over them again. You need to include contextual information, summary of the results and summary of the main arguments presented in previous sections in order to remind the reader what we want to emphasise and enhance the relevance of the arguments which will be presented later. Enumeration of the results obtained, including the most prominent or clear, and then those regarded as secondary or tentative. And comment on whether the results were obtained were expected or unexpected, and reference to previous studies to compare results or to support our own inferences or conclusions. So that's when you're asking people to go back to the background, or if there's very often what happens when you're doing a master's, or particularly when you're doing a PhD, the literature is moving all of the time. You can't keep rewriting your literature review, so you have to bear in mind other literature. What I've done in my thesis is my literature review is very much about the discipline. My literature review is about the nursing, but then when I came to the discussion, I've looked at similar things in other disciplines, if that makes sense.
So bringing in new literature, you mean?
Yeah, but yeah, if there's anything else, because you're trying to make a claim for your contribution, so you have to be careful because you can't include everything. You have to put limits on what you include in your literature review.
Yeah.
But I am aware of research in other disciplines that has similar results to some of the ones I've found. So
what might have not come up in your preliminary background, because you didn't know what.
Yeah, because I focused on nursing,
got it.
very much so. So the extent to which the research questions have been addressed, and then that leads into the conclusion, overall summary of the study, reflection upon the research question, limitation and questions that remain open with comments on possible solutions or ways to address them, recommendations for practice, recommendations concerning future research, and reflection upon yourself as a researcher. So what we did say in the first session where we looked at introductions, the other thing about the conclusion, it needs to mirror the introduction. So you kind of need to sort of write a conclusion and then go back to your introduction. So they do need to be closely related to one another. So one of the things that we don't mark in the dissertation, but we do ask students to produce an abstract, but an abstract might be really important, will be really important in terms of submitting to a journal. So the abstract is one of the most specific conventions of the academic genre. Its function is to help readers identify articles that may be relevant to their own reflections. So one of the things that we've kind of emphasised with the students in the dissertation workshops is to think of themselves and how they've searched for literature and how they've made a decision to include a piece of literature. It's very often based on the abstract. So it's not just something, so kind of getting them into the sort of frame of mind that this abstract is almost like the elevator pitch for the rest of the work. So if there are, that's really where the most significant aspects of the work need to come up. So there are two types. Descriptive abstracts describe what the study is about without referring to the method, results or conclusions. They're quite useful for people, particularly PhD students, very often when you're doing a PhD, or if you're doing another large kind of study, you're expected to disseminate as you go along, and so you might not have results or conclusions, so a descriptive abstract is very useful in those situations. And informative abstracts do refer to these issues, and they're the most common and they're recommended, so they do include methods or results or conclusions. The length typically moves between 250 and 500 words. So if you're using Arial 11 or 12 double spaced, then that's usually about 300 words for one page. It's kind of an unwritten rule, but generally in a dissertation, an abstract shouldn't go over more than one page. It looks quite badly presented. And the other thing is to think about keywords, because keywords, that's how we search. So how would you want somebody to search for your work? So this is, Liz, you came to the writing group, so you'll remember the Robert Brown's. We use this a lot in the writing group as a abstract that you can present to other people to get them to give you feedback on your writing without having to get them to read the whole thing, basically. And it's quite helpful, and we've had experiences where people have used this framework and emailed it off to a journal editor and said, would you be interested in publishing this work? And they either say yes or no or maybe. So it's quite a helpful kind of framework. I use this quite a lot, actually, and I've found it very, very helpful myself. And then Pat Thompson, who writes a lot about writing, that's her kind of description about how to write an abstract. And it's very similar. Locate your work to a wider audience, debate by briefly stating is the problem, what specifically does your dissertation address, zoom into your research question, anchor, introduce your lens or method by sinking into well-recognised researching in your discipline, what are your data findings, and your argument can be summarised as the answer to your research question. and what does the original knowledge you've created add to the field more than the real results, what others can do. So that significance is very often very important in an abstract, particularly if you're using an abstract to get your paper accepted at a conference. But once again, it goes back to this idea of the elevator pitch, you know, the idea if you had 3 minutes in an elevator with somebody and you were going to tell them, sell your work to them, what would you actually talk about? So, choosing a journal, that's quite an important thing to think about before you write. I think people very often have the idea that they'll write something, then they'll find a journal. And the most common reason why articles aren't published is a poor journal fit. So it's really important to get the fit right for the journal. So if you are thinking about that for your...
That was one of the things we were talking about actually, how that would work, whether we get them to just write a standard journal article for the purpose of their dissertation, research, presenting their research, or do we get them to do this at the beginning? But they wouldn't have actually undertaken their... Well, I suppose they could do this after they've undertaken the project, but before they write it up.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, you could do it in that.
It's time limited, isn't it, when you've got a 12-month project.
Yeah.
And we didn't actually come to an answer.
I think it's quite a good activity in that it engages people in what's published in a journal.
Yeah.
And it might engage them in the writing, how journal articles are actually written.
Yeah.
Very often it's a good idea to start with your reference list. If you try and publish in a journal and you haven't included any references from that journal, they're not.
Yeah.
Because anybody that they're using as a reviewer or anybody on the editorial will know the literature that's published in that journal, and if you're not acknowledging that, then they will say to you, actually, so network, mentors or supervisors, make sure that the journal is professional. And one thing that I published with a student where she had a real difficulty in getting her work published, nothing wrong with her work at all, but she'd done a dissertation. She did the HPE when we still used to run that course, and she'd looked at ODP's experiences in placement. So she wanted to publish in a journal that was going to be read by mentors of ODP students, and there are very few perioperative practitioner journals, and the ones that aren't peer reviewed, and they don't tend to publish research articles. So when she tried to submit, they didn't understand qualitative. She'd done a qualitative study, and they said, well, you know, you've only got 6 people. You know, they didn't know how to handle her article at all. And then she tried Nurse Education Today, and they said, this is really interesting, but Nurse Education Today is now based in Australia. They don't have ODPs in Australia. They said it's not related to nursing. So, but eventually she did get it published. But if you have a particular strong feeling, and that might be something for your students, are they going to publish in a practitioner journal, or are they aiming for a practitioner journal, or are they aiming for a scholarly academic journal?
And some of their work is it's so niche, you know, what they're researching is very, particularly in advanced practice, if they're specialists as opposed to general advanced practitioners, you know, they might have something incredibly niche that they're looking at, you know, and then that's a challenge in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, but there is an advanced practice journal, isn't there?
Yeah, but I'm thinking of, say they are an advanced practitioner in paediatric haemophilia or something.
Right.
You know, and this is what we're getting increasingly. We're getting these advanced practitioners doing amazing things in very, very specialist areas, and then it's guiding them really. I mean, I would find that challenging, you know, to guide someone like that who you wouldn't be quite sure
Yeah.
what journal. I mean, hopefully they would know, but
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the other thing that you can sign up for, and I did and I do it now, which is quite an interesting activity, and it might be one for the student, but I don't know how it would fit in. And what you do, you write a commentary, and what I do it for the evidence-based nursing journal. So they will send you a paper that's recently been published usually it's something medical, and get you to write a commentary and critique it.
okay, that's interesting.
So that you're recontextualising it for the discipline. So that might be one way to do it. I guess you could be really brave to start your own journal. That's that's one way. That's what Helen Walkington in geography did. She's a lecturer in geography. She started her own student journal.
I think it's more maybe getting students to think about how their findings or their research that they've done appeals to a wider audience.
Yeah, of course.
I think maybe that's kind of where I was coming from, that actually if you saw something that was very, very specific, you might think, oh, well, how's that relevant? And maybe they need to sell it more as I don't know, maybe they've started a nurse-led clinic or something. So it's just getting them to where they're going to pitch it. And it might be that when they come to publish, if they went for the traditional dissertation route, they might actually publish just part of their dissertation, which might be one of the themes, as opposed to everything.
You can't publish everything anyway. It's
you
quite
can't,
a big jump actually, going from. It's quite difficult.
So
you did it really quickly, record.
Let's do it whilst
Yeah, but I mean, it seemed to happen. A lot of the students I've worked with, even though they've got really good marks, they've really struggled because it isn't a cut and paste job at all. It's completely different, and I think what we've been looking at in the results shows that, doesn't it? Really, how you'd actually write them up for a journal, and ask advice, people to collaborate with. I think it's difficult because you can't collaborate with them when they're students, can you? Because then it's how much of it is their work. It needs to be their work, doesn't it? That's the difficulty. So this is a journal analysis. Get them to look. I mean, this is an activity they could do on any. It could be part. Look at the guidelines for authors for specific journals. Skim and scan the journal for topics, so what do they publish, and make a list of any keywords that characterise the journal, and how can you adapt your idea material to suit the journal's agenda. List the headings, subheadings used in 2 or 3 papers. This is quite important actually, and I'm at the moment what I'm trying to do is get my literature review published, and I find this quite a useful thing is how the papers are divided up and the number of words per section and proportion of paper in each section. So I think that's really interesting. I hadn't noticed that there was just this 3 paragraph, but I found that quite helpful by looking at another literature review in the journal that I'm aiming for, how many words. So then I think that's quite helpful. I mean, most journal articles aren't really more than 8,000 or 9,000 words. I don't think there's anything, is there really? And some of them are 4. How many was?
5, I think. But most of them I've seen are like kind of 2,000 to 3,000, which.
Yeah, this is quite challenging actually. Useful to look at what frameworks and methodologies are used, and how long and how defined is that section of the paper. So what you will find is that some journal articles have some journals have specific things that they want in specific sections. Also with literature reviews and other types of methodologies, there are publication standards that you need to follow if you're claiming that you're doing a particular technique or approach. And a good idea is to contact the editor about your proposed paper. I can't remember whether you did that or not, did you?
I don't think we did, but I've done it subsequently.
Yeah. And how's that gone?
So they've always been really positive and given like ideas. It's never turned into
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And they've always been very good at responding. Actually, I haven't had issues where they haven't.
No.
Replied,
No. And that's my experience with the writing group. And also sometimes it helped people because, and goes back to the niche things, that sometimes there's a special edition planned for something.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's easier to get your work published in a special edition. Sometimes it's more difficult. It depends how many people respond to the call, but that's very often very helpful and very often that is new areas where there isn't much published. So, just to sum up, so certain things about and this is, we've tried to do it a bit in these staff development sessions, but what we really do very much in the student workshops is looking about writing in progress and the writing process. So we just noted highlights of perspective on the academic text that is not obvious if we only pay attention to its final version. So you need to think about how you're going to present your claims, particularly if you're writing for publication. And I think even when you're writing qualitative research for publication, the journals very often make you feel that you need to be quite positivist and make really strong claims about what you found. I think
that's really hard, isn't it?
I think that's a real contradiction, and maybe that is about us as our discipline not feeling quite so confident. So the invisible side has to do with the process of construction of the academic text. So a crucial process that we need to make visible in order to learn about our strengths and weaknesses when writing this kind of text. It's not enough, it's only the starting point in a process of enculturation and academic literacy learning within our own knowledge field. And I think it's very different publishing in different disciplines, and even to the extent that there are different communities and there are different cultures around different publications. For example, I don't know anyone recently that's had a good experience with the Journal of Advanced Nursing. And it's very much determined by the editor of the journal and how the culture that they establish. Now with the Journal of Clinical Nursing, and obviously we know who the editor is, there's a big emphasis on international, and how the international, and I think that's very hard for our students because they just need to think about how they're going to make it appeal to an international audience. And we need to make our voices visible, and I think that's hard. Okay,
Thank you.
That's it. I hope that was helpful.